Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. October in Colorado gets cold fast, especially up in the mountains where I'd been living since my divorce finalized earlier that year. I'd moved to Granite Falls after signing the papers in August. 33 and starting fresh seemed less pathetic in a place where nobody knew my history. The town had maybe 4,000 people, tucked between peaks that already had snow on them, and I'd rented a cabin about 20 minutes outside the main strip. That Saturday morning, I'd signed up for a trail cleanup event at Bear Creek Trail, one of those community service things I figured would help me meet people who weren't just the cashier at the grocery store or my landlord. The email from the Parks Department said to meet at 8 in the morning at the main trailhead. Bring work gloves if you had them, and they'd provide trash bags and those grabber stick things. I pulled into the gravel parking area around 7:45, counting maybe 15 cars already there. The volunteers stood in a loose circle near the information board, most of them wearing worn hiking boots and flannel jackets, holding steaming cups from their thermoses. I recognized a few faces from town. The woman who ran the bakery, a couple of guys I'd seen at the hardware store, an older man who walked his German Shepherd past my cabin sometimes. Everyone seemed to already know each other, laughing about something someone's kid had done at the school play, discussing whether we'd get early snow this year. I stood at the edge of the group, pulling my work gloves from my jacket pocket, trying to look busy while actually feeling completely out of place. That's when this guy approached me, probably mid-40s, wearing a bright orange vest like the ones road workers use, carrying a clipboard and giving me this huge, welcoming grin that made his whole face crinkle up. "First time volunteering with us?" he asked, and I nodded, grateful someone was actually talking to me. He introduced himself as Nathan, said he'd been organizing these cleanups for about 2 years, really passionate about keeping the trails beautiful for everyone. He had this way of talking where he'd lean in slightly, like whatever you were saying was the most interesting thing he'd heard all day, and he kept touching my elbow when he'd point out different trail sections on the map he pulled from his clipboard. Nathan explained we'd be split into groups of 4 or 5, each taking a different section of the trail system, and that he'd make sure to put me with some friendly folks since I was new. The weird thing was when the actual Parks Department coordinator showed up, a woman named Carol wearing an official uniform with the Colorado Parks logo, Nathan just kept standing there next to me, still holding his clipboard, still wearing that orange vest that I noticed didn't have any official logos or badges on it. Carol gathered everyone together and started explaining the day's plan, pretty much repeating everything Nathan had already told me, except she divided us into groups of 3, not 4 or 5. She assigned me to work with the bakery owner, Janet, and her husband, Tom, pointing out that we'd be taking the lower loop near the river. Nathan wasn't on her list at all, but he just nodded along like he knew exactly what was happening, then told Carol he'd float between groups to help where needed, and she seemed fine with that, though I caught her giving him this quick look I couldn't quite read. We grabbed our supplies, trash bags, those grabber things, a bucket for any broken glass, and headed out onto the trail, Janet chatting away about how they'd been doing these cleanups since they moved here in 2009, asking me about my cabin, whether I'd survived my first real mountain thunderstorm yet. All this normal, small-town, friendly stuff that was actually starting to make me feel welcome. About an hour into the cleanup, we'd filled 2 bags with the usual stuff. Energy bar wrappers, water bottles, cigarette butts, even a busted camping chair someone had just left behind. Tom was telling this story about finding a whole tent full of empty beer cans last year when Nathan appeared on the trail ahead of us, coming from the direction we were heading, rather than from behind where the other groups were working. He waved us over, said he'd spotted what looked like a major dump site just off the trail, maybe 50 feet through the trees. Too much for one person to handle alone. Janet immediately said we should get Carol, that dump sites sometimes had hazardous stuff, but Nathan insisted it was just regular trash, probably from some college kids having a party, nothing dangerous, and he'd already started bagging it up but needed extra hands. Tom checked his watch and mentioned we should probably take our break anyway. Carol had said to meet back at the parking area at 10:30 for water and snacks, and it was already past 10. Nathan jumped on that immediately, his whole face lighting up like Tom had just given him the best idea. "Hey, if you're heading back for break anyway, I can show you a shortcut," he said, looking directly at me even though he was supposedly talking to all three of us. "There's an old service road that cuts straight back to the parking lot. Saves you probably 15 minutes versus going back the way we came. I use it all the time when I'm out here doing my own cleanup work." Janet started to say something about sticking to the marked trails, but Nathan was already pointing through the trees to the left, explaining how the old road connected to the back end of the parking area, right where the portable toilets were set up, and we could grab our snacks and be back before anyone even noticed we'd taken a different route. The way he kept focusing on me while he talked, like Janet and Tom weren't even there, made my chest feel tight in this way I tried to ignore. Told myself I was just being paranoid because I'd been alone too much lately. Tom actually seemed interested in the shortcut, started asking Nathan about whether it was the same service road they'd used to bring in equipment when they rebuilt the footbridge last spring. But Janet grabbed her husband's arm, said something about her knee acting up and needing to take the easier path back, the one they knew. Nathan's expression flickered for just a second, this flash of irritation that made him look completely different from the friendly volunteer helper he'd been playing all morning, before the big smile came back. He turned to me then, completely turned his back on Janet and Tom, and asked if I wanted to see the shortcut anyway. Said he could show me real quick while they headed back the long way, and we'd probably still beat them to the parking area. "Always good to know multiple routes," he said, already taking a few steps toward the trees, especially for someone new to the area. These trails can get confusing if you don't know all the little connections. I actually took a step toward him. Even now, writing this, I can't believe I actually took that step. Started to follow this stranger into the woods just because I didn't want to seem rude or unfriendly. But Janet spoke up, louder this time, almost sharp, saying, "She's with our group, Nathan. Carol assigned the groups for a reason." The way she said his name, with this edge to it, made me stop and really look at her face. Her expression was pleasant enough, still smiling, but her eyes were locked on Nathan with this intensity that made me suddenly very aware that we were pretty far from the parking area, pretty far from the other groups, and that nobody except Janet and Tom actually knew where I was right then. Nathan laughed, this easy, casual sound that didn't match the way his jaw had tensed up, and said sure, of course, he was just trying to be helpful, share some local knowledge with a newcomer. We started walking back the way we'd come, Janet keeping me between her and Tom, Nathan trailing behind us for a while before eventually disappearing off to the side, supposedly to check on another group. Janet kept up this steady stream of chatter about her bakery, asking if I'd tried her sourdough yet, telling me about the farmer's market on Saturdays, normal stuff. But her hand stayed on my arm the whole walk back, gentle but firm, like she was making sure I stayed with them. When we got to the parking area, most of the other groups were already there, Carol passing out bottled water and granola bars from a cooler in her truck. I grabbed my water and walked over to thank Janet for showing me the ropes, and that's when she pulled me aside, glanced around to make sure nobody was close enough to hear, and asked me in this low, careful voice if Nathan had approached me before today, if I'd seen him around town, if he'd maybe been to my cabin. The question made my whole body go cold in this visceral way that finally broke through my polite social programming. I told her no, I'd never seen him before this morning, and asked what was going on, why she was asking. Janet exchanged this look with Tom, one of those married couple conversations that happens without words, before she told me that Nathan had been showing up to these cleanup events for about 6 months. Always had some reason to be there, but was never officially on the volunteer list. And 3 times now, young women who'd joined the groups had mentioned him making them uncomfortable, trying to separate them from others, offering to show them shortcuts or special spots along the trails. Carol had tried to tell him he needed to register properly if he wanted to volunteer, but he always had some excuse, Some reason he was just passing through, just helping out. And since he'd never actually done anything they could report, they couldn't exactly ban him from public trails. I looked around the parking area then, scanning the groups of volunteers who were getting ready to head back out after break, but I didn't see Nathan anywhere. Neither did Janet when I asked her, and that seemed to worry her more than anything else. She grabbed Carol, pulled her over, and quickly explained that Nathan had tried to get me alone on some shortcut trail, and now he'd disappeared. Carol's face went tight, and she immediately did a head count, checking her clipboard against the people standing around, asking each group if everyone was accounted for. That's when we realized Melissa was missing. A young woman from Fort Collins who'd driven up for the event, probably 25 or 26, auburn hair in a ponytail, wearing a Colorado State University sweatshirt. She'd been working with the group on the upper trail, and her team leader said she'd mentioned needing to use the bathroom about 40 minutes ago, headed back toward the parking area where the portable toilets were, and they'd assumed she'd just gone straight to break afterward. Carol called Melissa's phone immediately, and we could all hear it ringing somewhere nearby. This cheerful pop song ringtone echoing from the woods behind the portable toilets, exactly where Nathan had said his shortcut came out. Tom and 2 other guys jogged over to look while Carol called 911, and they found the phone about 30 feet into the trees, lying in the dirt next to a dropped water bottle and 1 work glove. The screen was cracked but still working, and when Carol picked it up with a tissue to preserve any fingerprints, we could all see the text message that was typed but never sent, just sitting there in the message field. "He's not part of the team." The timestamp showed she'd started typing it 28 minutes ago. The police arrived within 15 minutes, benefits of a small town where nothing much happens, and they immediately started searching the woods, brought in dogs within the hour, but Melissa and Nathan were both gone, just gone, like they'd never existed. Except for that phone and that unsent warning that she'd tried to give someone, probably her friend who was supposed to pick her up later, before Nathan had stopped her from hitting send. The search went on for 3 days. They found Nathan's orange vest snagged on a branch near the river crossing about 2 miles from the trail, and Melissa's other glove further downstream, but nothing else. The police discovered Nathan's truck parked at a different trailhead 5 miles away, one that connected to the same trail system through those old service roads he'd mentioned. Inside, they found maps of the entire trail network, with handwritten notes about quiet spots and low traffic times, plus a notebook with descriptions of various women who'd attended previous cleanup events. Hair color, approximate age, whether they'd come alone, which cars they'd driven. My description was in there from that morning. New, divorced, cabin off Forest Road 7, white Subaru, isolated. The FBI got involved after that, connected Nathan to similar disappearances in Wyoming and Montana, always at volunteer trail events, always targeting women who were new to the area, always vanishing without a trace afterward. They never found Melissa. Her parents came down from Nebraska, stayed in town for 2 weeks, put up posters everywhere, but eventually they had to go home with nothing but questions. The theory was that Nathan had some kind of hideout in the backcountry, maybe an old mining cabin or cave system, somewhere he could disappear to when things got hot. The police searched every structure in a 20-mile radius, used helicopters with thermal imaging, brought in cave specialists to check the old mines, but the mountains up here are vast and full of places where someone who knows the terrain could hide forever. What haunts me most is thinking about those 40 minutes between when Melissa left her group and when we realized she was gone. She must have run into Nathan near the toilets, maybe recognized him from the morning meeting, thought he was safe because he was wearing that official-looking vest, and followed him just far enough into the trees for him to reveal who he really was. Just like I almost did, except I had Janet watching out for me, and Melissa had nobody. I moved out of Granite Falls 2 months later, not because anyone blamed me or treated me differently, but because I couldn't drive past that trailhead without thinking about how close I'd come, couldn't see the mountains without wondering if Nathan was still up there somewhere, watching, waiting for things to calm down so he could come back with a different name, different vest, same friendly smile. Janet helped me pack, and on my last day she told me something that still gives me nightmares. About a month before the cleanup event, she'd seen Nathan at the grocery store, standing near the community bulletin board where I'd pinned a note about looking for hiking buddies since I was new to town. He'd been taking a photo of it with his phone. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time, just figured he was interested in hiking too. But now she wondered if that's how he'd known to target me, if he'd been planning it for weeks, researching where I lived, when I'd be alone, how isolated my cabin was. The FBI agent I spoke with before leaving said they'd linked Nathan to at least 7 disappearances across 3 states over 4 years. Always the same pattern, always women who were new to the area or visiting. Always at organized outdoor events where he could blend in as a helpful volunteer. They never caught him. Sometimes I check the news from Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, looking for reports of missing hikers. And every time I see one, I wonder if it's him with a new name, new vest, new hunting ground. But what really keeps me awake at night is knowing that I survived purely by chance. Because Janet happened to be protective. Because Tom happened to mention the break at the right moment. Because something in Janet's voice made me stop walking toward those trees. Melissa probably had those same instincts, probably felt that same chest-tightening worry, but she didn't have a Janet, and that text she tried to send, "He's not part of the team," was her trying to be her own warning system, trying to protect herself or maybe warn others, and it wasn't enough. It's never enough when they know the terrain better than you, when they've had months to plan, when looking helpful is their camouflage. October in our town meant one thing, the annual fall fair that everyone pretended was better than it actually was. I'd been running the ring toss booth for my uncle since I turned 16, and now at 23, I knew every vendor, every security guard, and every inch of that muddy field we called a fairground. That Saturday started like any other, with me hauling stuffed animals from my uncle's van while the morning fog still clung to the grass. The Ferris wheel creaked its familiar protest as workers tested it, and the smell of funnel cake already hung thick in the air, even though we wouldn't open for another 2 hours. I remember joking with Beverly, who ran the cotton candy stand next to us, about how we'd probably see the same faces we saw every year. The Brennan family with their matching flannel shirts, old Harold who'd spend all day at the beer garden, and the groups of teenagers who thought they were too cool to be there but showed up anyway. The afternoon crowd picked up around 2, and that's when I first noticed her. Not because anything seemed wrong, but because she was helping a little kid who dropped his corn dog in the dirt. She couldn't have been more than 17, wearing one of those oversized hoodies that kids like these days, the purple one with the high school mascot on it. She bought the crying kid a new corn dog with her own money, and I remembered thinking that was pretty decent of her. Maybe an hour later I saw her again with a group of friends near the Gravitron, all of them laughing and filming each other trying to eat caramel apples without getting it all over their faces. Normal teenage stuff, you know? The kind of thing you see 100 times every fall fair and don't think twice about. But something made me keep noticing her throughout the day. Not in a creepy way, just one of those things where once you see someone, you keep spotting them in the crowd. Around 5:30, when the sun started painting everything orange and the air got that perfect October bite to it, I noticed her again, but this time she was alone. She stood between the corn maze entrance and the row of food trucks, typing on her phone with this intense focus, her face all scrunched up like she was worried about something. That's when I saw him for the first time. Baseball cap pulled low, plain gray jacket, nothing special about him except the way he was standing. He was by the churro stand, maybe 20 feet from her, holding a cup of something but not drinking it, just holding it. When she moved toward the lemonade truck, he moved too, keeping that same distance. When she got in line, he suddenly found something very interesting to look at on the prize board at the basketball game right next to the lemonade truck. The way he moved wasn't random. It was deliberate, calculated, like he was playing some kind of game only he knew the rules to. I had a line of customers then, families wanting to win giant teddy bears, so I had to focus on my booth. But between customers, I kept glancing over, and each time, he was there, always that same distance from her, always pretending to be interested in something else. She'd moved to the kettle corn stand, and he was examining the menu at the BBQ place next door. She walked toward the portable restrooms, and he suddenly needed to throw something in the trash can nearby. The girl kept checking her phone, typing fast, and at one point she looked around quickly, like she was trying to spot someone in the crowd. Her whole body language had changed, shoulders hunched, walking faster, not stopping to look at anything anymore. I wanted to say something, do something, but what? Walk up to her and say, "Hey, that guy might be following you." What if I was wrong? What if he was just some dad waiting for his kid or something? You always think you'll know exactly what to do in these situations until you're actually in one. Then she did something that made my chest tighten. She ducked behind the funnel cake truck and just stood there, pressed against the back of it, peering around the corner. The man in the baseball cap had stopped too, standing by the ring toss game across from my booth, still holding that same cup he'd been carrying for at least 20 minutes now. He was scanning the crowd, methodical, his head moving slowly from left to right. When he didn't see her, he actually walked the entire perimeter of the food truck area, passing right by where she was hiding. She waited until he was on the opposite side before she darted out, heading toward the edge of the fairgrounds where the exhibitor parking was. But here's what made everything worse. As soon as she moved, he turned around like he'd been expecting it, like he knew exactly what she'd do. He didn't run after her, didn't even walk fast. He just followed at that same steady pace, confident, like someone who knew exactly where this was heading. I finally couldn't stand it anymore and called out to Larry, our security guy who usually hung around the beer garden. Told him there was something weird going on with some guy following a teenage girl around. Larry, who was probably pushing 70 and moved about as fast as you'd expect, said he'd take a look but had to go break up some argument at the pig races first. By the time I looked back, the girl was already at the far end of the fairgrounds, near where the exhibitor trucks and employee vehicles were parked. The man had picked up his pace now, closing the distance between them. She was practically jogging, her purple hoodie making her easy to track even in the growing shadows between the vehicles. The last clear view I had was her weaving between two livestock trailers, and him following maybe 30 seconds behind. After that, the crowds, the trucks, and the fading light swallowed them both. I kept watching that area, waiting to see her come back, telling myself she probably just found her parents' car or met up with friends. But she never came back through the main area. About 10 minutes passed, and I was getting more anxious by the second. I asked Beverly to watch my booth and started walking toward the parking area myself, but it was chaos over there. Hundreds of cars, trucks with horse trailers, RVs, all crammed into a field with barely any lighting. I walked up and down a few rows, calling out, asking if anyone had seen a girl in a purple hoodie, but most people were either inside their vehicles or already heading back to the fair. Then I heard it, a truck engine starting up, that distinct diesel rumble. Through the maze of vehicles, I caught a glimpse of a black pickup truck moving without headlights on, navigating between the rows. It was moving slow and careful, like whoever was driving didn't want to draw attention. The weird part was that everyone else had their lights on. It was getting dark enough that you needed them, but this truck crept through the shadows like it was trying to stay invisible. It reached the exit onto the access road, and only then did the lights flicker on, just as it turned onto the main road and accelerated away. I ran back to find Larry, and this time I wasn't taking no for an answer. Found him by the cotton candy stand, told him we needed to call the real police right now, that I'd seen this girl being followed and now she was gone, and there was this truck that left with no lights on. Larry actually listened this time, maybe because of how panicked I must have looked. He radioed the fair coordinator, and within minutes, we had 2 sheriff's deputies there. I told them everything, about the girl in the purple hoodie, the man in the baseball cap, how he'd followed her to the parking area, the black truck leaving without lights. They took it seriously, started asking specific questions. Did I know who she was? Had I seen either of them before? Could I describe the man better? Problem was, I'd been so focused on his behavior that I hadn't really studied his face. Average height, average build, that gray jacket and baseball cap, probably somewhere between 30 and 45. Could have been anybody. The deputy said they'd checked the security cameras and started walking around asking other vendors if they'd seen anything. That's when things got really bad. About 20 minutes later, while I was still talking to one of the deputies, a woman came running up to us, completely hysterical. She was looking for her daughter, Ashley, 17 years old, supposed to meet her at the main entrance at 7 but never showed up. When the deputy asked what she was wearing, the woman pulled out her phone, showing us a photo from earlier that day, purple hoodie with the school mascot on it. My whole body went cold. The deputy's expression changed completely, and he immediately got on his radio, calling for backup and asking someone to review the security footage right away. The mother kept saying Ashley always answered her texts, always, and she'd sent one message at 6:40 saying some creep wouldn't leave her alone, then nothing. She showed us the text, "Mom, this guy in a baseball cap won't stop following me between the food stands, coming to the car." That was it, the last thing she ever sent. Within an hour, the whole fairground was swarming with police. They shut down all the exits, started checking every vehicle trying to leave, interviewing everyone they could find. They pulled the security footage from the 3 cameras they had, one at the main entrance, one by the ride ticket booth, and one overlooking part of the parking area. The footage was grainy and mostly useless, but that last camera caught something. At 6:52, you could see Ashley walking alone toward the back section of the parking area, moving fast. 6:53, a figure in what looked like a baseball cap following the same path. 6:54, nothing, just empty frame. Then at 6:56, a black truck pulling out from that same area, driving slowly with no lights until it hit the access road. They couldn't get a clear shot of the license plate. The angle was wrong and the quality was too poor. But that timestamp matched exactly with when I'd seen that truck leaving. The detective who talked to me later said that 2-minute window between the man following her and the truck leaving, that was everything. Whatever happened, it happened fast. They found her phone the next morning in the parking field, screen cracked, tossed under a livestock trailer about 50 feet from where I'd last seen her. There was blood on the gravel nearby, not much, but enough. The forensics team spent hours going over that whole area, but overnight rain had washed away most of whatever evidence might have been there. The really sick part was that he must have planned it all, knew exactly where the cameras were and weren't, knew the lighting was bad in that section, knew there'd be enough chaos and noise that nobody would hear anything. The police interviewed over 200 people who were at the fair that night. 3 other teenage girls came forward saying they'd noticed a man matching that description, hanging around them earlier in the day, making them uncomfortable enough that they'd stayed in groups. One girl, Kayla, said he'd asked her for directions to the parking area around 4 o'clock, but something about the way he smiled when he asked made her lie and point him toward the opposite end of the fairground. She said his teeth were too white, like those fake veneers people get, and he had this smell like cigarettes covered up with too much cologne. Details that haunt you afterwards, wondering if you could have done something different. They never found Ashley. They never found the truck either, even though the police put out an alert across 3 states. The FBI got involved after a week, connected it to 2 other similar disappearances at county fairs in the past 3 years. Same pattern, teenage girl alone, man in a baseball cap, vehicle leaving the scene right after. They think he scouts the fairs during the day, picks his target, waits for the right moment when they're separated from their group. Patient, methodical, invisible in the crowd of ordinary people just trying to enjoy their day. I quit working at the fair after that. Actually, I quit a lot of things. Moved back in with my parents, started seeing a therapist who says survivor's guilt is common even when you weren't the direct victim. But I can't stop replaying that day, seeing all the moments I could have done something different. Should have left my booth, approached her directly, walked her to security myself, gotten a better look at his face, memorized that truck's license plate. The fair still happens every October, but I don't go. Beverly told me they added more cameras and hired real security guards now. Not just retirees looking for extra cash, but Ashley's still missing. And somewhere out there, that man in the baseball cap is probably walking through another crowd, holding another cup he's not drinking, watching. The fog had gotten so thick on Interstate 84 through Oregon that I couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. And after 16 hours of hauling refrigerated goods, my eyes were playing tricks on me. I'd been driving trucks since my divorce papers got finalized in 2011, and at 41, I figured I'd seen every weird thing these highways had to offer. The dashboard clock showed 2:47 a.m. when I spotted the Cascade View Rest Area sign emerging from that thick soup of white. My bladder had been screaming for the past hour, and the coffee thermos I'd drained somewhere around Baker City wasn't helping. The parking lot lights were mostly off when I pulled in, which should have been my first warning. Only one sodium lamp flickered near the main building, casting these long, distorted shadows across the empty spaces. Construction barriers lined half the lot, and a sign reading "Closed for renovation, no facilities available" stood crooked against some orange cones. This was supposed to be October peak travel season, but the place looked like it had been abandoned for months. But that single restroom light glowing through the fog, right there in the men's room window, told a different story. Maybe the construction crew left it on, or maybe they kept one bathroom operational for emergencies. Either way, my options were limited to either using that bathroom or pissing in a bottle in my cab like some rookie. I grabbed my flashlight from the door pocket and killed the engine. The silence hit different out here. Not peaceful, but heavy, like the fog was swallowing every sound before it could travel. My boots crunched on loose gravel as I walked toward that lone light, passing abandoned construction equipment and stacks of concrete barriers. The door handle felt colder than it should have, even for an autumn night, and when I pushed it open, the hinges screamed like they hadn't been touched in weeks. Inside, the fluorescent light buzzed and flickered, giving everything this sickly, greenish tint. The renovation hadn't reached this bathroom yet, but it looked rough. Cracked tiles, rust stains running down from the faucets, and that smell of old bleach mixed with something else I couldn't place. 3 stalls lined the left wall, all with their doors hanging slightly open except the middle one, which was shut tight. A backpack sat on the floor next to the sinks, one of those expensive hiking types with all the straps and clips. Strange thing to leave behind, I thought, walking closer to check it out. The main compartment hung open, and right there on top of some crumpled clothes sat an iPhone, propped up against the fabric. The screen was still on, still recording video, the red recording button blinking at the top. My first instinct was to call out, ask if anyone was there, but something about the setup made me pause. The phone's battery showed 12%, and the recording timer read 3:47:23. Almost 4 hours of continuous recording. Who leaves their phone recording for 4 hours in an abandoned rest stop bathroom? I picked it up carefully, trying not to smudge any fingerprints in case this was some kind of crime scene. The video showed mostly darkness with occasional glimpses of the bathroom ceiling when someone must have adjusted the phone's position. I started scrubbing backward through the footage, watching shadows move in reverse, until I hit something that made me stop breathing. There was a person in frame, someone wearing a baseball cap pulled low, standing in front of that closed middle stall. The timestamp showed 11:14 p.m., which meant this happened just a few hours ago. The person in the video stood perfectly still, just facing that stall door like they were waiting for something. Then they knocked. 3 slow, deliberate raps that echoed in the empty bathroom. A voice came from inside the stall, muffled but clearly terrified, saying something I couldn't quite make out. The person with the cap tilted their head, listening, then reached into their jacket pocket. They pulled out what looked like a long, thin piece of metal, maybe a coat hanger that had been straightened out. They slid it through the gap between the door and the frame, working it around like they knew exactly what they were doing. The whole time, Whoever was in that stall kept talking, pleading, their voice getting higher and more desperate. After about 30 seconds of working that metal piece, there was a click, and the stall door swung open from the outside. The video got shaky after that, like whoever was holding the phone, probably the person in the stall, had started panicking. But in those last few seconds before the recording angle went wild, I saw the person with the cap step into the stall, saw them reaching forward with both hands, and then the phone must have fallen, because suddenly it was just showing the backpack's interior. The audio kept going though. Shuffling sounds, something being dragged across the tile floor, and then footsteps walking away. After that, nothing but the buzz of the fluorescent light for the next 3.5 hours. I looked at that middle stall, still closed tight, and noticed something I'd missed before. There were scratch marks on the tile floor leading from the stall to the main door, like something heavy had been dragged out. My brain kept trying to process what I'd just watched while my body stood frozen in that bathroom. The smart thing would be to get back to my truck, call 911, and let the cops handle this. But something made me walk toward that middle stall, maybe the same stupid curiosity that makes people slow down at accident scenes. The door was locked from the inside now, which didn't make sense given what I'd seen in the video. I got down on my knees, angled my flashlight under the gap, and immediately wished I hadn't. There were dark stains on the floor, still wet, and something white that looked like a broken fingernail. But what really got me was the smell coming from under that door. Metallic and thick, the kind that sticks to the back of your throat. I stood up fast, maybe too fast, because I knocked into the sink and sent the backpack sliding across the floor. That's when I heard it, a phone ringing, but not the iPhone I was holding. The sound was coming from inside the closed stall, a cheerful default ringtone that felt completely wrong in this place. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then stopped. The silence that followed felt alive somehow, expectant. Then a text message sound pinged from inside the stall. Another ping, then another. Someone was trying to reach whoever had been locked in there. I backed toward the door, still holding that iPhone with its dying battery, when I heard something that made every hair on my body stand up. Footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, crunching across the gravel. They stopped right outside the bathroom door. The handle started to turn just like in the video, except this time I was the one trapped inside. The door began to open, and through the gap, I could see the outline of someone wearing a baseball cap. I didn't think, just reacted, throwing my full weight against the door and slamming it shut. The person on the other side stumbled back, and I heard them hit the gravel hard. My fingers fumbled with the deadbolt, finally getting it locked just as they started pounding on the door. Not knocking like in the video. This was violent, desperate hammering that made the whole frame shake. They weren't saying anything, which somehow made it worse. Just that relentless pounding while I stood there, trying to figure out my next move. The bathroom had no windows, no other exit. My truck keys were in my pocket, but my truck was 50 feet away through that fog, and whoever was outside stood between me and it. The pounding stopped suddenly, and I heard footsteps moving away, circling around the building. They were looking for another way in. I grabbed the backpack, shoved the iPhone inside, and tried to think. The person knew this place, knew about the renovation, probably knew every possible entrance. Then I remembered the construction equipment outside. There had to be tools, maybe something I could use to defend myself. The footsteps had moved to the back of the building now, and I could hear metal scraping against metal. They were trying to pry open a service door or ventilation grate. I turned off my flashlight and stood in the flickering green light, listening to them work. That's when the lights cut out completely. The electrical box, I realized. They'd killed the power. In the absolute darkness, I heard that service door finally give way with a shriek of bent metal. They were inside the building now, somewhere in the walls or ceiling, moving through the renovation areas. I could hear them crawling through the space above, tiles shifting and creaking under their weight. I knew I had maybe 30 seconds before they found a way to drop down into the bathroom. In the pitch black, I felt my way along the wall to the door, unlocked it as quietly as I could, and slipped outside. The fog hit me like a physical thing, so thick I could barely see my own feet. But I knew my truck was straight ahead, maybe 50 feet through the construction zone. I started moving, trying to remember where the barriers were, where the equipment sat. Behind me, I heard a ceiling tile crash down inside the bathroom, followed by the thud of someone dropping to the floor. They'd realize I was gone in seconds. I picked up my pace, stumbling over something metal that clanged loud enough to wake the dead. Sure enough, the bathroom door burst open behind me, and I heard those footsteps again, faster now, coming straight for me. My hand finally found the cold metal of my truck's door handle, and I yanked it open, practically falling inside. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the fog to reveal a figure standing just 10 feet away. Not running anymore, just standing there in that baseball cap, head tilted like they were studying me. I threw the truck in reverse, tires spinning on the loose gravel, and got the hell out of there. As I pulled onto the highway, I grabbed my CB radio with shaking fingers and called in an emergency to any trucker or cop who might be listening. 20 minutes later, I met 2 state troopers at a gas station and led them back to the rest stop. We found the bathroom exactly as I'd left it. The backpack, the phone still recording though, now dead. The scratch marks, the blood. But when they finally got that middle stall open with bolt cutters, it was empty except for more blood and a wallet belonging to someone named Brandon Hewitt. The cops took everything as evidence, launched a whole investigation. They found Brandon's car abandoned 5 miles up a service road, but never found Brandon himself or whoever took him. The detective assigned to the case called me a few weeks later, with an update that made my skin crawl all over again. They'd recovered the full video from the iPhone, including deleted segments from earlier in the evening. Brandon had been documenting his solo hiking trip, talking to the camera about the trails he'd explored that day. In one clip from around 9 p.m., he mentioned stopping at the rest area despite the construction signs because he desperately needed a bathroom. But here's what really got me. In the background of that video, barely visible in the corner, there was someone already there, sitting in a van in the far corner of the parking lot, just sitting there in the dark, waiting. The police enhanced the image and found something else. Construction equipment in the van's back window that matched tools stolen from a work site 40 miles away. Whoever this person was, they'd been using closed rest stops as hunting grounds, knowing travelers would still stop despite the warnings, knowing they'd be isolated and vulnerable. I don't drive that route anymore. Switched to a completely different corridor, even though it adds 3 hours to my deliveries. The cops never found the person in the baseball cap, never found Brandon, never even identified who was driving that van. They put out warnings, increased patrols at rest stops, but nothing ever came of it. Sometimes I wonder if that person is still out there, maybe at a different rest stop, maybe with a different method, just waiting in the dark for someone desperate enough to ignore a closed sign. I kept a copy of one frame from that video, the one where you can just barely make out the figure standing by my truck as I drove away. Something about their posture, the way they just stood there watching me leave. It wasn't disappointment or anger. It was patience. Like they knew there would be others, knew there always would be. And the worst part? They were probably right. Every night, someone somewhere pulls into an empty rest stop, sees that one light still on, and decides to risk it. Every small town in Michigan has that one farmer's market where locals sell honey, vegetables, and homemade soap. And ours on Birchwood Road was no different. I'd been managing a coffee shop downtown since graduating with my photography degree, 24, and still trying to figure out if I'd made the right choice. Jenna had been my closest friend since freshman year of high school. She was the one who dragged me into that first photography class, insisting I had an eye for composition even when I couldn't see it myself. That Saturday afternoon, we were helping her younger sister with an environmental science project about seasonal changes in local ecosystems. Behind the market, there was this incredible stretch of woods where the maple trees turned burnt orange every fall, perfect for the shots we needed. We'd been planning this for weeks, waiting for the leaves to hit that perfect point between green and brown. The afternoon started out completely normal, almost boring even. We'd been there since around 2, taking macro shots of decomposing leaves, fungi growing on fallen logs, and the way afternoon light filtered through the canopy. Jenna was lying flat on her stomach, trying to get the perfect angle on some mushrooms growing at the base of an oak tree, while I was adjusting my tripod near a cluster of ferns about 20 feet away. The market was winding down for the day. We could hear vendors packing up their trucks in the distance. That familiar sound of wooden crates being stacked and truck doors slamming. The woods felt peaceful, just the occasional rustle of squirrels gathering acorns and the distant hum of the highway beyond the tree line. I remember checking my phone and seeing it was almost 4:30, thinking we should probably wrap up soon before we lost the good light. That's when Jenna stood up, brushing dirt off her jeans, and grabbed my arm with this strange expression on her face. "Don't look right away," she whispered, her fingers digging into my forearm harder than necessary. "But there's someone watching us, behind the big elm tree maybe 40 yards back." Her voice had this forced calm to it, like when you're trying not to scare a child, but I could feel her trembling slightly. I kept fiddling with my camera settings, pretending to review the shots on my LCD screen while slowly angling myself to get a better peripheral view. At first, I thought maybe it was just another photographer or someone from the market taking a walk. But then I saw him. A man in dirty brown work boots and what looked like a canvas jacket, crouched low between 2 trees, holding something up to his face. The way he was positioned, completely still except for the slight movement of his hands adjusting whatever he was holding, made every nerve in my body start firing warning signals. I forced myself to laugh at something on my camera screen, nudging Jenna like we were just looking at photos together. "Pack up naturally," I said through my smile, keeping my voice light and steady. "We're leaving right now." We started gathering our equipment with deliberate casualness, me collapsing my tripod, Jenna zipping her camera bag, both of us fighting the urge to run. The whole time I kept stealing glances toward where the man was positioned, and that's when I realized what he was holding: binoculars. Heavy, military-style binoculars that he had trained directly on us. The woods suddenly felt different, like all the ambient sounds had dropped away except for our own movements and breathing. Even the vendors at the market seemed impossibly far away now. As we walked back toward the parking area, maintaining that forced normal pace, I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere behind us, closer than where he'd been before. We made it to Jenna's car, a beat-up blue Subaru with too many bumper stickers, and the second the doors closed, she locked them and started the engine in one motion. "Should we call someone?" she asked, her voice shaking now that we could drop the act. I was already dialing 911, my fingers fumbling with the phone screen. While the phone rang, I kept watching the tree line, and that's when I saw him again. He'd moved to the edge of the woods, just standing there in the shadows between the last row of trees and the gravel lot. The operator answered, and I tried to explain what happened without sounding paranoid. But how do you describe that particular flavor of fear when someone's been watching you? The woman on the line said she'd send an officer to check it out, took our information and told us to wait in a safe location. Jenna drove us to the front of the market where there were still people around, and we sat there with the engine running, watching the rearview mirrors. Officer Daniels showed up about 15 minutes later, a younger guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on a Saturday evening. We walked him back to where we'd been shooting, Jenna and I staying close together while pointing out the exact spots. I expected him to brush us off, maybe suggest it was just a bird watcher or someone hiking, but his demeanor changed when he saw the disturbed undergrowth where the man had been crouching. There were clear boot prints in the soft earth, and a worn path that led deeper into the woods, like someone had been going back and forth regularly. Officer Daniels radioed for backup, telling us to stay by his patrol car. Within 20 minutes, there were 3 more officers and a detective named Reeves, a woman with sharp eyes who asked us to describe every detail we could remember. They formed a line and started moving through the woods systematically, their flashlights cutting through the growing dusk. About 200 yards in, One of the officers called out, and everyone converged on a small clearing hidden behind a thick cluster of evergreens. Jenna and I couldn't see much from where we waited, but we watched Detective Reeves emerge from the tree line, her face grim, speaking rapidly into her radio. She called for crime scene techs and more units, using codes I didn't understand, but that made Officer Daniels, who'd stayed with us, go pale. "We need you both to come to the station," Reeves said when she reached us, her tone professional but urgent. "We've found something significant." During the ride there, she wouldn't tell us what they'd discovered, but I could see her jaw clenching and unclenching in the driver's seat. At the station, they separated Jenna and me into different rooms, where I spent 3 hours going over every second of our encounter with different detectives, describing the man's clothing, his approximate height and build, the exact timeline of events. It wasn't until Detective Reeves came back around 9 that night that I learned what they'd found. She sat across from me with a folder of photographs, her expression careful and controlled. "We discovered a campsite," she said, spreading out pictures of a small tent covered with camouflage netting, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look, along with several cell phones, wallets, and driver's licenses. She showed me photocopies of the IDs, 3 women and 1 man, all between 20 and 35, all from towns within a 50-mile radius. I recognized one of the names, Claire Hoffman, from news reports about a missing hiker from the previous month. My throat went completely dry as she explained that these were all people who'd been reported missing over the past year, their cases previously unconnected. The campsite had a portable camp stove, canned goods, and disturbingly a journal filled with detailed observations about people who visited the woods, including dates, times, physical descriptions, and license plate numbers. Detective Reeves flipped through more photos, showing me pages from the journal, though she kept most of the content covered with her hand. What I could see made my skin prickle. Neat, cramped handwriting describing people's routines, which days they typically came to the market, who they were usually with. One entry from 3 weeks earlier mentioned 2 young women with cameras, early 20s, brown and blonde hair, artistic types, with our exact arrival and departure times from a previous scouting trip Jenna and I had made. We hadn't even noticed anyone that day, had felt completely alone in those woods. The detective explained they'd found evidence suggesting the man had been living out there for at least 6 months, maybe longer, moving his camp periodically but always staying within the same half-mile radius. The most disturbing part was a plastic storage container buried near the tent, wrapped in garbage bags, that contained personal items clearly taken from different people. A distinctive turquoise ring, a medical alert bracelet, a wallet with the cash removed but all the cards and photos still inside. They kept us at the station until almost midnight, going through missing persons files, asking if we recognized any other names or faces. Jenna's parents came to pick her up around 11, but I drove myself home, taking the longest route possible to avoid passing anywhere near Birchwood Road. The detective said they'd launched a massive search for the man, that they had his DNA from items in the camp, his fingerprints from the journal, but somehow he'd vanished completely by the time they'd started looking. They theorized he'd been somewhere nearby, watching the entire police response, and had simply melted away into the network of woods that stretched for miles beyond the market. What haunts me most is that final detail Reeves mentioned almost offhandedly. In the journal's most recent entry, dated that very morning, he'd written about planning to make contact with his next subjects, that he was tired of just watching, that today felt like the right time to introduce himself properly. The search went on for 3 weeks. They brought in dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging, even volunteer search teams from surrounding counties, but they never found him. The farmers' market shut down temporarily while they combed every inch of those woods, and when it reopened a month later, they'd cleared a 100-foot buffer between the market and the tree line, installed motion sensor lights, security cameras, the works. Detective Reeves called me about 2 months after everything happened to tell me they'd connected the items in the tent to 4 missing persons cases, but they still had no idea who the man was, no matches in any database, no missing person report that fit his description. The truly unsettling part was that when they analyzed the journal more thoroughly, they found he'd been documenting visitors to those woods for at least 2 years. Hundreds of entries about different people, their habits, their vulnerabilities, notes about who came alone, who seemed distracted, who would be easy to approach. They arrested someone about 8 months later, a drifter they picked up 3 states over who matched our description. But it wasn't him. Jenna was so sure at first, but when we went to identify him through the one-way glass, we both knew immediately it was wrong. The eyes were different, the way he held himself, everything. The real guy, the one from the woods, had this stillness about him, like a spider waiting in its web, perfectly patient. This wasn't him. The case went cold after that, though Detective Reeves assured us they'd keep it open indefinitely. Jenna moved away the following year, said she couldn't drive past that market without feeling sick. I still live here, still manage the same coffee shop, but I've never gone back to those woods. Sometimes customers mention hiking back there, taking their kids to pick wild blackberries in the summer. And I want to grab them, tell them what we found, warn them about what might still be out there. But I don't. I just suggest other places they might enjoy more. Places with better trails, better berries, better anything to keep them away from those trees where someone once sat watching, writing, waiting for the perfect moment that, thank God, never came for us. The morning air had that November bite that makes you pull your jacket tighter, and I remember checking my watch, 5:45, as Duke pulled me toward the park entrance. I'd been walking that same route through Riverside Park for maybe 6 years, ever since my divorce papers got finalized and I moved into the townhouse on Walnut Drive. Duke, my golden retriever, knew every tree, every bench, every spot where the squirrels like to hide. That particular morning started like any other, except for the car parked by the eastern tree line with its engine running and headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. A silver sedan, one of those generic 4 doors you see everywhere, positioned oddly between 2 oak trees where there wasn't really a proper parking spot. The exhaust fumes drifted white in the cold air, and I could hear the low rumble of the engine from 50 feet away. Duke wanted to investigate naturally, but I kept him on the path because whoever was in that car probably wanted privacy. Maybe someone having a rough night, or catching a few minutes of sleep before work. The windows were fogged up from the inside, and I couldn't make out anyone through the condensation, though the driver's seat looked occupied from the angle I had. I finished our usual loop, about 40 minutes total, and noticed the car hadn't moved an inch. Still running, still glowing in the darkness. By the time Duke and I headed home, the sky was starting to lighten to that pale gray that comes before sunrise, and I figured whoever it was would be heading out soon. I made breakfast, showered, had my usual 2 cups of black coffee while reading the news on my tablet, and completely forgot about the car until I had to run to the hardware store around 10 that morning. The quickest route to Hanson's Hardware cuts right through the park, so I decided to walk instead of drive, maybe grab a coffee at the place on 3rd Street afterward. The silver sedan was still there. Same exact spot, same position between those 2 oaks, but now the engine was off and the headlights were dead. The driver's door hung wide open, swaying slightly in the breeze. From where I stood on the path, I could hear something playing from inside. That harsh, crackling sound of radio static turned up too loud. The windows had cleared of condensation, and I could see straight through to the passenger side. Empty. The driver's seat was pushed back all the way, like someone really tall had been sitting there, and there was a coffee cup in the center console, steam still rising faintly from it in the cold air. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds trying to process what I was seeing, because none of it made sense. People don't just abandon their cars with the door open and the radio blasting static. I walked closer, slowly, calling out a "hello?" That came out quieter than I intended. No response. The static kept crackling, oscillating between frequencies like someone had been scanning through stations and just left it between channels. Could see a wallet on the dashboard, brown leather, thick with cards, and a phone face down on the passenger seat. A jacket was draped over the back of the driver's seat, one of those expensive wool coats you see downtown professionals wearing. The coffee cup was still half full, and when I got close enough, I could see the liquid was barely lukewarm, maybe an hour or two old at most. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing broken. Just an abandoned car with all the owner's belongings still inside, like they had simply vanished mid-sip. I pulled out my phone and called 911, explaining the situation to the dispatcher, who seemed more concerned when I mentioned the personal items left behind. 2 patrol cars showed up within 15 minutes, and I watched from a nearby bench as the officers examined the scene. They ran the plates, tried the phone, it was locked, and carefully bagged the wallet. One officer, a younger guy with a notebook out, came over to ask me questions. When exactly had I first seen the car? Was anyone else around? Did I touch anything? I told him everything about my morning walk, how the car had been running for hours with someone possibly inside, and how I'd found it like this on my way to the hardware store. He wrote it all down, occasionally glancing back at his partner who was on the radio, probably running the owner's information from the registration. The officer's partner, an older woman with sergeant stripes, walked over with a concerned expression that made my chest tighten. She asked me to describe again exactly what I'd seen that morning, specifically about whether I was certain someone had been in the driver's seat. I explained about the fogged windows, the angle of my view, how I couldn't be completely sure, but it looked occupied. She nodded slowly, then told me the car belonged to a Jason Whitmore, age 41, an insurance adjuster from Fairview Heights about 20 minutes away. His wife had called him in missing when he didn't come home from what was supposed to be a quick evening drive to clear his head. That was yesterday evening, which meant the car had been running in that spot for over 12 hours, maybe more, before I first saw it. The timeline made even less sense now. Why would someone sit in an idling car all night, then disappear right when the park started getting foot traffic? They brought in a K9 unit around noon, a German shepherd named Rex, who immediately picked up a scent from the driver's seat. The dog led his handler straight from the car toward the tree line, nose to the ground, tail rigid with focus. About 30 yards into the woods, Rex stopped at a fallen log and started circling, whining in that way police dogs do when they've found something significant but confusing. The handler called for the sergeant, and they spent several minutes examining the area. I couldn't see what they were looking at from where they had me wait, but I heard one officer radio for additional units and mention something about unusual ground disturbance. They started stringing up yellow tape between the trees, expanding the perimeter, and that's when they told me I needed to leave the scene but to stay available for follow-up questions. I gave them my contact information and walked home the long way, avoiding the park entirely, my mind racing through possibilities. The local news picked up the story by evening. Local man vanishes from park, investigation ongoing. But they had even less information than I did. I couldn't stop thinking about that coffee cup still steaming in the cold. Jason Whitmore had been sitting in that car, drinking coffee, probably listening to the radio, and then just... what? Got out and walked into the woods? But why leave everything behind? Why leave the door open and the radio playing? I learned from the news report that he had no history of mental illness, no financial troubles, no reason to disappear. His wife described him as a devoted father of 2, steady and predictable, the kind of man who called if he was going to be 10 minutes late. The reporters interviewed a few people at the park, including Mrs. Grayson, who walked her poodles there every morning, and she mentioned seeing the car too. Said she'd noticed it because the headlights were so bright they hurt her eyes when she passed. 3 days passed before the police called me back. Detective Angela Foster wanted to meet in person. Said she had some follow-up questions about what I'd observed. We met at the station, in one of those small rooms with uncomfortable plastic chairs and fluorescent lights that hum just loud enough to be annoying. She pulled out a file thick with papers and photographs and asked me to look at something. The photos showed the area where the dog had stopped, that fallen log and the ground around it. In one picture, I could see what looked like drag marks in the dirt, leading from the log deeper into the woods. Another photo showed Jason Whitmore's shoe, a brown Oxford, found about 50 yards from where the dog lost the scent. Just one shoe, the left one, laces still tied. Foster asked if I'd seen anyone else that morning, any other cars, anyone on foot near the woods. I hadn't, and I told her so, but then I remembered something that seemed insignificant at the time. There had been a maintenance van in the park parking lot when I'd arrived that morning, one of those white vans with no windows in the back and a ladder on top. I'd noticed it because it was parked crooked, taking up 2 spaces, and it had mud splattered all up the back doors even though it hadn't rained in over a week. The detective's expression changed when I mentioned this, and she asked me to describe everything I could remember about the van. I couldn't recall any company name or logo, just that it was white, dirty, and had that ladder. She wrote everything down, then showed me another photograph. This one was from a traffic camera on Riverside Drive, time-stamped at 4:17 that morning. A white van, no visible plates, turning into the park entrance. 23 minutes before I arrived for my walk. Foster explained they'd found similar tire tracks near where Jason's shoe was discovered, and they were trying to trace all white vans registered in the county, but without plates or distinguishing marks, it was slow going. Detective Foster then told me something that made my whole body go cold. They'd found evidence of at least 3 other similar incidents in parks across the state over the past 8 months. Same pattern every time. A car found running or recently abandoned. Personal items left behind. The owner vanished without a trace. 2 of the cases had similar tire tracks nearby, possibly from the same or similar vehicle. The victims had nothing in common. Different ages, genders, professions, cities. The only connection was that they'd all been alone in isolated areas during early morning or late evening hours. She said they were working with state police now, treating it as a possible serial abduction case. They'd analyzed Jason's coffee cup and found traces of something unusual. Not a drug exactly, but a compound that could cause disorientation and muscle weakness if inhaled in concentrated amounts. The theory was that someone had been watching these people, waiting for them to be alone and vulnerable, then somehow introducing this substance into their vehicles, maybe through the ventilation system, while they sat there unaware. The investigation went on for weeks, but they never found Jason Whitmore or the white van. His family held a memorial service after 3 months with no leads, no body, no answers. I stopped walking in the park after that, started driving to a gym across town instead. Every time I see a white van now, especially those without windows, my heart races, and I find myself checking the plates, looking for mud on the doors, watching to see where it goes. Detective Foster called me one last time about 6 months after Jason disappeared to tell me they'd connected 2 more cases to the pattern, but still had no solid leads. She thanked me for my help and said they'd be in touch if anything developed. That was 2 years ago now, and I still think about that morning sometimes, about the coffee steam rising in the cold air, about how Jason Whitmore was just trying to clear his head with a drive and ended up becoming another unsolved case. The park reopened after a few months, and people walked their dogs there like nothing happened, but I know some of them remember, especially the early morning regulars who now walk in groups, never alone, always watching the tree line and checking the parking lot for white vans that don't belong. Coach Bryant kept us late that Thursday, running penalty kicks until our legs felt like rubber and the field lights had to come on. I remember jogging down Sycamore Avenue afterward with my cleats bouncing against my backpack, thinking about the geometry test I hadn't studied for yet, and whether Mom had made her famous Thursday night lasagna. The neighborhood was settling into that quiet hour when everyone's inside starting dinner, and I could smell wood smoke from someone's fireplace mixing with the wet leaves that covered most of the sidewalks. My 13th birthday was coming up the next month, and I was already planning my argument for why I deserved a new phone, practicing the speech in my head as I walked the familiar 20-minute route home from school. Every house along Sycamore looked warm and lived in, porch lights beginning to glow, except for the Brenner place. 3 stories of rotting wood and broken dreams that had been sitting empty since before we'd moved here 5 years ago. The realtor sign had fallen over so many times they'd finally just removed it, and now the house just sat there, making everyone walk a little faster when they passed by. That evening changed everything though, because as I was doing my usual quick walk past the property, trying not to look at the overgrown hedge that had swallowed half the front gate, I caught movement in the second-floor window facing the street. A person was standing there, about 3 feet back from the glass, completely motionless like they were watching something specific down below. The failing light made it hard to see details, but I could make out a tall frame wearing what appeared to be a long, dark coat, maybe navy or black, with their arms hanging straight down at their sides in this weirdly formal way. My first thought was that someone had finally bought the place and was probably measuring for curtains or checking out the view, so I did what any polite kid from the suburbs would do. I raised my hand in a friendly wave. The figure didn't acknowledge me at all, didn't even shift their weight or turn their head slightly, just continued that perfect stillness that made my neck prickle for reasons I couldn't explain. Friday's practice ended at the same time, and I found myself oddly anxious as I approached the Brenner house on my walk home. Part of me expected to see a moving truck or some sign of life, maybe contractors' vehicles or a dumpster for renovation debris, anything that would explain yesterday's visitor. But the place looked exactly the same. Dead grass, paint curling off the siding like old scabs, and that rusty mailbox with its door hanging open at a broken angle. I slowed down as I got closer, pretending to adjust my backpack straps while really scanning the windows for any sign of movement. The late afternoon sun hit the glass at a different angle than the day before, and I could see straight through most of the first floor. Nothing but empty rooms and what looked like water stains spreading across the ceiling. Then my eyes traveled up to that second-floor window, and there they were again. Same exact spot, same dark coat, same unnaturally rigid posture. This time I stopped completely, standing right there on the sidewalk to get a better look, and I noticed something that made my throat go dry. The person's hands were perfectly aligned with the seams of their coat, fingers pointing straight down like a soldier at attention, but their head was tilted at this subtle angle that suggested they were looking directly at me. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes, having this bizarre staring contest with someone whose face I couldn't quite make out, before my courage cracked and I practically jogged the rest of the way home. The logical part of my brain kept trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a security guard checking on the property, or someone from the bank that probably owned it doing inspections. But security guards move around. They check different rooms. They don't stand in the exact same position in the exact same window at the exact same time 2 days in a row. That night at dinner, I pushed my food around my plate while Mom talked about her day at the dental office where she worked, and Dad scrolled through his phone reading news articles out loud, and I kept almost saying something about the Brenner house but couldn't figure out how to explain it without sounding like a paranoid kid. Finally, when Mom asked why I wasn't eating much, I just said practice had been really tough and excused myself to do homework, even though I spent most of the time looking up the Brenner house online, finding nothing except a few old real estate listings from 2012 with photos that showed empty rooms and descriptions about great potential and perfect for renovation. The weekend gave me a break from walking past the house, but I couldn't stop thinking about that figure in the window. Saturday morning, while Mom drove me to my friend Kevin's house, I made her take Sycamore Avenue instead of our usual route, claiming there was construction on Oakwood Drive. As we passed the Brenner place, I pressed my face against the car window trying to see up to the second floor, but the angle was wrong, and the sun's glare made it impossible to tell if anyone was there. Mom didn't even glance at the house, just kept talking about how she'd run into Kevin's mother at the grocery store, and how they were thinking of putting in a pool next summer. I wanted to ask her if she knew anything about the Brenner house, who owned it, why it had been empty so long, but something held me back. Maybe because I knew she'd want to know why I was asking. and I wasn't ready to explain that I'd been seeing someone in there who stood frozen like a department store mannequin for exactly 1 hour every evening. Monday came too fast, and as I sat through practice, I kept checking the sky, watching the sun sink lower, calculating whether I could convince someone's parent to give me a ride home instead of walking. But when Coach Bryant finally blew his whistle and everyone started packing up, I knew I had to see if the pattern continued. My teammate Oliver lived roughly in my direction, and I walked with him for the first 10 minutes, talking about the upcoming game against Riverside Middle. But when we reached the corner where he turned off toward his street, I was alone again. The Brenner house loomed ahead, and this time I noticed something new before I even got close. The porch light was on. Not the weak, flickering kind of light you'd expect from an old bulb that someone forgot about, but a strong, steady glow that made the peeling paint and broken railing look even worse by comparison. I slowed my pace, counting my steps, trying to delay the moment when I'd have to look up at that window. And when I finally did, my whole body went cold despite the sweat from practice still drying on my skin. The figure was there, but this time they weren't alone. There was another person standing in the window directly beside them, wearing an identical dark coat, maintaining that same perfect stillness with their arms pressed against their sides. Two of them now, both facing the street, both positioned exactly 3 feet from the glass, their heads tilted at precisely the same angle like they'd been arranged by someone obsessive about symmetry. The new person was shorter, maybe 5'8" compared to the original 6 feet, but everything else about their posture and positioning was disturbingly identical. I actually took a step backward into the street, nearly getting clipped by a passing minivan whose driver honked and yelled something I didn't process, because I couldn't look away from those windows. The worst part was that even with the porch light illuminating more of the house's facade, I still couldn't make out their faces, just dark shapes where features should be, like someone had taken an eraser to their heads and left only shadows. My brain scrambled for explanations, mannequins, cardboard cutouts, some kind of weird art installation. But deep down I knew these were real people because I could see the subtle rise and fall of their chests, barely perceptible, but definitely there, proving they were breathing, alive, waiting. I ran the rest of the way home, my backpack slamming against my spine with each stride, and burst through our front door so hard that Mom dropped her coffee mug in the kitchen. She rushed over asking what was wrong, if someone had chased me, if I was hurt, and I just stood there panting, trying to figure out how to explain what I'd seen without sounding completely insane. Finally, I told her everything. The figure in the window, how they appeared every day at the same time, and now there were 2 of them, just standing there watching the street. Mom's face went through several expressions, from concern to confusion, to something that looked almost like recognition, and she made me sit down at the kitchen table while she called Dad to come home from his office early. While we waited, she kept asking me specific questions. Was I sure they were real people? Had they ever tried to communicate with me? Had I seen them anywhere else? And her voice had this careful quality, like she was trying not to scare me more than I already was. Dad arrived within 20 minutes, still wearing his work clothes but with worry lines creasing his forehead. And Mom repeated everything I'd told her while I sat there nodding and adding details when she missed something. They exchanged these meaningful looks that parents do when they think kids aren't paying attention. And then Dad said we were all going to take a drive to the Brenner house right now, together, to see what was going on. The sun had already set by then, and as we pulled up to the curb across from the house, the porch light was still glowing strong, casting weird shadows through the overgrown bushes. Dad told us to stay in the car while he walked up to the front door, and I watched him climb those creaky steps, his silhouette brave against that harsh light, before he knocked 3 times on the door that I was certain nobody would answer. He waited maybe 30 seconds, knocked again louder, then walked around the side of the house with his phone flashlight on, disappearing from view while Mom reached back to squeeze my shoulder. When he came back 5 minutes later, his face was pale and he was already dialing someone on his phone, speaking in a low, urgent voice to whoever answered about needing a patrol car at the Brenner house immediately. While we waited for the police, Dad got back in the car and locked all the doors. which he never did in our neighborhood, and told us that the back door had been forced open recently. The wood splintered around the lock. He'd looked through the windows with his flashlight and seen sleeping bags, food wrappers, and bottles scattered across the floor of what used to be the living room, clear signs that people had been staying there. The police arrived in 2 squad cars, and we watched from our car as 4 officers entered the house with their flashlights sweeping through the darkness, their radios crackling with static and coded messages I couldn't understand. They were inside for what felt like forever but was probably only 15 minutes, and when they came out, they were escorting 3 people, 2 men and a woman, all wearing those long dark coats I'd been seeing in the window, their faces gaunt and expressionless as they were guided into the patrol cars. One of the officers, a woman with sergeant stripes, came over to talk to my parents, explaining that these were homeless individuals who'd been squatting in the abandoned property, and from what they could tell, they'd been watching the neighborhood kids walking home from school, timing their routines, though she couldn't say exactly why. The sergeant mentioned something that still gives me chills when I think about it. They'd found notebooks in the house filled with detailed schedules of when kids passed by, physical descriptions, which houses they entered, even notes about which ones walked alone versus in groups. The 3 people weren't talking much, she said, but they seemed to be part of some group that believed watching children during what they called transition hours would reveal something important, though what exactly remained unclear. They'd been living in the house for about 2 weeks, taking turns standing in that window during the after-school hours, maintaining their strange vigil with a dedication that bordered on religious devotion. The woman they arrested had told one officer that they were documenting patterns, but wouldn't elaborate on what that meant or what they planned to do with the information. Mom pulled me closer as the sergeant talked, and I could feel her trembling slightly, probably thinking the same thing I was, that I'd been walking past those watching eyes every single day, becoming part of their bizarre documentation without knowing it. The police said they'd be increasing patrols in the area, and that the city would finally be boarding up the Brenner house properly, with proper locks and security measures to prevent anyone else from getting in. For weeks after that night, Mom drove me to and from practice, making excuses about errands she needed to run anyway, though we both knew the real reason. The Brenner house got boarded up as promised, thick plywood covering every window and door, with bright orange "No Trespassing" signs posted all around the property, and eventually the city put up a chain-link fence around the entire lot. I never found out what happened to those 3 people, whether they went to jail, got psychiatric help, or just moved on to watch children from some other abandoned house in another neighborhood. Sometimes I still think about them standing in that window, perfectly still, counting us as we passed like we were birds migrating south or cars on a highway, trying to divine some meaning from our daily routines that the rest of us couldn't see. The house was finally demolished the following spring, and now there's just an empty lot there with tall grass and wildflowers, though I still walk on the opposite side of the street when I pass by, unable to shake the memory of those dark silhouettes arranged so precisely in the window, watching and waiting for reasons I'll probably never understand. Teaching English in a small Polish village wasn't exactly what I'd pictured doing after finishing my master's degree, but here I was, 6 months into a language exchange program about an hour outside Krakow. The village had maybe 2,000 people, most of them elderly farmers or young families who commuted to the city for work. That Monday evening in November started like every other weekday, conjugating verbs with bored teenagers, stopping at the only restaurant that served food past 7 for some potato and cheese pierogi, then heading to my landlady's house to pick up Buddy. Pani Nowak had broken her hip 2 weeks earlier, and since her daughter lived 3 hours away in Warsaw, I'd volunteered to walk her golden retriever twice a day. Buddy was this gorgeous, calm dog who never pulled on the leash and always waited patiently while I fumbled with my keys in the dark. The arrangement gave me something to do besides scroll through social media in my tiny apartment, and honestly, having a dog around again made the whole foreign experience less lonely. My usual route with Buddy took us through the newer part of the village, past identical brick houses built in the 80s. But that night he had other plans. The moment we stepped outside, he started pulling toward the old cemetery road, this narrow path that ran between the church and the eastern cemetery wall. The main road through our village connected everything important: the school where I taught, the church with its oxidized copper spire, the small market that closed at 6, and behind the church, the cemetery that seemed to go on forever. I tried steering Buddy toward our regular direction, but he planted his paws and whined, something he never did. The street lamps from the main road threw just enough light onto the cemetery path that I could make out where we'd be walking. Since it was only about 8:30 and other dog walkers were probably still out, I let Buddy lead the way. The second we turned onto that narrow road, everything felt colder, quieter, like the sounds from the main street couldn't quite reach us anymore. The path itself was maybe 4 feet wide, pressed between the church's old stone wall on one side and the cemetery's iron fence on the other. Through the fence bars, I could see rows of headstones, some dating back to the 1800s according to what locals had told me, their surfaces covered in moss and lichen that looked black in the darkness. The smell changed immediately once we entered. Wet leaves mixed with something sharper, almost metallic, that made me wrinkle my nose. Buddy had stopped whining completely now, moving forward with this intense focus I'd never seen from him before. His ears were perked up, his whole body rigid with attention as he led me deeper down the path. The cemetery gate was about 60 meters ahead, and even from a distance, I could tell someone was standing there. At first, I thought maybe it was the groundskeeper or Father Wojciech checking on something. But as we got closer, I realized this person was too tall, too still, wearing clothes that didn't match anyone I knew from the village. The man stood perfectly motionless beside the cemetery gate, dressed in a long gray coat that nearly touched the ground. His posture was strange, completely rigid, arms at his sides facing the gate but not trying to open it, just standing there like he was waiting for something or someone. In the weak light that filtered through from a distant street lamp, I could see he had thin dark hair that hung past his collar, and his face was turned slightly away from us. What really made me want to turn around immediately was how Buddy reacted. The dog went completely stiff, planted his feet, and let out this low, continuous growl that vibrated through the leash into my hand. Buddy loved everyone, literally everyone, from the grumpy man who ran the market to the kids who sometimes pulled his tail. But here he was, warning me about this stranger in a way that made every instinct scream at me to leave. I started backing up slowly, keeping Buddy's leash tight, but then the man moved. Not toward us, thank God, but he raised one hand and pressed it flat against the cemetery gate, fingers spread wide like he was feeling for something through the metal. That's when I noticed the items arranged on the ground around his feet. Several white candles placed in a semicircle, though none were lit, and what looked like rope coiled in a specific pattern I didn't recognize. A dark canvas bag sat open beside him, and I could see tools inside. Definitely a small shovel, some kind of pry bar, and other things I couldn't identify in the dim light. The whole setup looked deliberate, ritualistic even, like he was preparing for something that required specific steps and equipment. He kept his hand pressed against the gate and I heard him speaking, not loudly, more like murmuring or chanting in a language that definitely wasn't Polish or English, something with harsh consonants that seemed to catch in his throat. My phone was in my pocket, but I was terrified that any movement might draw his attention fully toward us. Buddy's growling had gotten louder, more aggressive, and he was pulling backward now, trying to get us away from the man, which was all the encouragement I needed. We backed up faster, my eyes still locked on the stranger, watching as he moved his hand across the gate in slow, deliberate motions, almost like he was drawing invisible symbols on the metal. Then he reached down into his bag and pulled out what looked like a glass jar, filled with something dark, liquid or powder, I couldn't tell, and began pouring it along the base of the gate. The smell that reached us was awful, like rotten eggs mixed with something chemical that burned the inside of my nose. That's when I finally turned and ran, Buddy racing beside me, both of us sprinting back toward the main road like our lives depended on it. Behind us, I could hear the man's voice getting louder, the foreign words echoing off the church wall, but I didn't look back until we reached the pool of light from the street lamps. Once we hit the main road, I didn't stop running until we reached Pani Nowak's house, my lungs burning and legs shaking from the sprint. I fumbled with the gate latch, practically threw Buddy into the yard, and locked it behind us before collapsing on the front steps. Part of me wanted to call the police right then, but what would I even say? That I saw a creepy guy standing by the cemetery with some candles and rope. They'd probably think I was just another paranoid foreigner who'd watched too many horror movies. Plus, my Polish wasn't great when I was calm, and right now I could barely form coherent thoughts in English. I decided to wait until morning, maybe talk to Father Wojciech first since it was his church's cemetery. I brought Buddy inside, gave him extra treats for being such a good guard dog, and tried to convince myself that what I'd seen was just some local tradition I didn't understand, maybe someone visiting a grave in their own peculiar way. I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak of my old apartment building, checking the locks on my door 3 times before finally crawling into bed around 2 in the morning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's pale hand pressed against the gate, remembered that terrible smell, heard those guttural words that sounded more like cursing than praying. When my alarm went off at 6:30, I actually felt relieved that the night was over. I got ready for work mechanically, trying to push the whole incident out of my mind, telling myself it would seem less frightening in daylight. But when I walked to school that morning, taking the long way to avoid the cemetery road completely, I saw 2 police cars parked outside the church and yellow tape blocking off the entrance to that narrow path. My heart started racing again as I watched officers walking in and out, their faces serious, some of them taking photos of something I couldn't see from where I stood. I stood there frozen for probably 5 minutes watching the police activity before Marta, one of the other teachers at school, came up beside me and grabbed my arm. She looked pale, almost sick, and immediately started talking in rapid Polish before remembering to switch to English for my benefit. Someone had tried to dig up one of the old graves during the night, she said. The grave of some wealthy merchant from the 19th century who'd been buried with his jewelry, according to local legend. The groundskeeper had found the scene early this morning when he came to unlock the cemetery for elderly parishioners who liked to visit graves before morning mass. But it wasn't just the attempted robbery that had everyone shaken. It was how the person had tried to do it. The police had found exactly what I'd seen the night before. Melted candles arranged in a perfect semicircle, rope tied in intricate knots around the iron fence posts, and strange symbols drawn on the gate with what turned out to be a mixture of sulfur and coal dust. The worst part, Marta whispered while glancing around nervously, was what they found inside the partially dug grave. The coffin had been pried open just enough to reach inside, but whoever did it hadn't taken anything. Instead, they'd left something behind. She wouldn't tell me exactly what, just shook her head and muttered something about old superstitions and things better left buried. The police were calling in specialists from Krakow, she said, people who dealt with cases involving what she called unusual circumstances. I wanted to tell her about what I'd seen, about the man in the gray coat, but my throat felt tight and the words wouldn't come. She must have noticed something in my expression because she squeezed my arm harder and asked if I was feeling all right. If I'd heard anything strange last night since my apartment was only a few blocks away. I just shook my head, mumbled something about needing to get to class, and walked away on unsteady legs. I taught my classes that day in a complete fog, going through the motions while my mind kept replaying what I'd witnessed. During lunch break, I finally worked up the courage to approach one of the police officers still at the scene, a younger guy who looked less intimidating than the others. In my broken Polish mixed with English, I managed to explain that I'd been walking my landlady's dog the previous night and had seen a man near the cemetery gate around 8:30. His whole demeanor changed immediately. He called over his supervisor, pulled out a notebook, and started asking detailed questions. What did the man look like? Tall, thin, long gray coat. dark hair past his collar. Did I see what he was doing? Setting up candles, rope, had tools in a bag. Did he see me? Maybe. His head turned slightly, but he didn't follow us. They exchanged meaningful looks when I mentioned the strange language he'd been speaking, something that sounded ancient and harsh. Definitely not any European language I recognized. They caught him 3 days later, trying to break into another cemetery 2 villages over, using the exact same method: the candles, the rope patterns, the sulfur mixture on the gates. Turned out he was part of some group that believed old graves contained not just treasures, but specific items needed for their rituals, things that had been buried with the dead for protection or punishment centuries ago. The police never did tell me what he'd left in that merchant's coffin, but Father Wojciech had the entire cemetery blessed twice that week, and locals started leaving fresh flowers and crosses at the violated grave every single day. I finished out my teaching contract, but I never walked past that cemetery after dark again. And even now, years later, whenever I smell sulfur or see candles arranged in a circle, I remember that night and the way Buddy knew, just knew, that we needed to run.